This is Sergeant Elias, and this is the story of how, in front of 1,000 men ready to die, his rank was disregarded, and his faith was called a delusion by a superior officer who almost led them all to their graves. It was a day when public humiliation tried to silence the voice of God, but only made it louder. The dignity of a good man was trampled into the dust of the backlands, out of pure arrogance and disbelief. Has your faith ever been tested in such a public and cruel way? Before I tell you how God acted in his life, turning this humiliation into honor before the very ones who mocked, comment here where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place things in his hands, even when the whole world says we're crazy. The conflict began in that stuffy command tent, with the smell of canvas, sweat, and anxiety mixing in the heavy air. Outside, the backland's sun beat down mercilessly, causing the fine dust to rise. With every movement of the 1,000 soldiers awaiting their final orders, it was a forward operating base, a makeshift camp in the middle of nowhere, and the approaching mission was of the highest risk. The tension was almost a physical thing, something you could touch. At the center of it all, the young Lieutenant Ricardo, a recent graduate with a chest puffed out with pride, presented his plan of attack. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had memorized all the manuals, pointing to maps and citing complex strategies. To the eyes of the novices, he was a genius. To the eyes of Elias, he was a dangerous boy playing with lives. Sergeant Elias, a 48-year-old black man, listened to it all in a silence that many mistook for disinterest. But it wasn't. His body was there, but his spirit was elsewhere, in an intimate and silent conversation with God. The night before, while the other officers reviewed tactics, Elias had knelt beside his cot. He didn't ask for victory, nor for glory. He asked only for clarity and protection for his men, and the answer came not as an audible voice, but as a deep certainty, a clear and terrifying mental image. The main route, the one the lieutenant was now calling brilliant, was a trap. He saw the ravine, the blind spots, the crossfire coming from above. It was a slaughterhouse. This certainty weighed on his chest like an anvil. As Lieutenant Ricardo concluded his presentation with a dramatic flourish, receiving nods of approval from the other officers, Elias felt his heart tighten. He knew what he had to do, and he knew the cost. To challenge a superior in front of the troops, especially one as vain as Ricardo, was professional suicide. He looked at the faces around him. He saw boys who had barely left their teens, their eyes shining with admiration for the lieutenant, ready to follow him blindly into the abyss. He remembered his own youth, the naivety, and the desire to prove his worth. He also remembered the friends he lost because of brilliant plans that ignored the wisdom of the terrain and the intuition of the elders. The responsibility for those lives was greater than the fear of humiliation. When the lieutenant asked if there were any questions, a silence of obedience filled the tent. No one would dare to question. It was in this silence that Elias's soft, firm voice cut through the air. "Lieutenant, excuse me." All eyes turned to him, surprised. Elias rarely spoke in briefings, preferring to act rather than make speeches. Lieutenant Ricardo arched an eyebrow, a mixture of irritation and condescension already forming on his face. He saw Elias as a museum piece, a veteran good for routine tasks, but outdated for modern warfare. The faith the sergeant showed in his quiet gestures was, for the lieutenant, a sign of weakness, a superstition that had no place in an environment of logic and military strategy. The young officer's patience was visibly short, with the utmost respect in his posture, but with an urgency that only he understood, Elias approached the map. He did not point his finger accusingly. He simply indicated, "Lieutenant, with all due respect to your strategy, but this route through the gorge, it worries me. Intelligence says the path is clear, I know, but it's treacherous terrain, a funnel. If there is an enemy force, even a small one, waiting on the high ground, we will be trapped. We will have nowhere to retreat or take cover." He spoke with the calmness of someone describing a fact, not an opinion. His eyes did not convey fear, but a deep seriousness, the seriousness of someone who had seen death up close and knew how to recognize its scent before it arrived. Elias's suggestion was an alternative route, longer, more exposed in some stretches, but one that avoided the critical point his intuition pointed to. In the eyes of conventional military strategy, it seemed an illogical detour, a defensive and cowardly choice. For Lieutenant Ricardo, it was the final affront. He felt his brilliance being questioned by a feeling from a sergeant who, in his view, barely knew how to read a satellite map correctly. Mockery began to spread across the faces of the younger officers, who exchanged discreet smiles. They saw what the lieutenant wanted them to see, a fearful old man trying to hinder progress. The tension in the tent shifted from anxiety to an imminent confrontation. Lieutenant Ricardo let out a short, dry laugh that echoed cruelly in the silent tent. He approached Elias, invading his personal space, a clear gesture of intimidation. "Sergeant," he began, his voice laden with sarcasm, "I appreciate your concern, but since when is the command of this battalion based on concerns and feelings? Since when are the visions and shivers of a superstitious soldier worth more than months of strategic planning, satellite images, and intelligence reports?" Each word was a stab, delivered publicly to wound not only the professional, but the man and his faith. The humiliation was being carefully constructed piece by piece for all to witness. Elias remained motionless. He felt the weight of the stares on him, the shame the lieutenant wanted to impose. Inside, a battle was being fought. The anger, the wounded pride, the urge to respond in kind, all of it bubbled up, but another force, much older and more powerful, kept him standing. It was the faith inherited from his parents, simple country folk who faced drought and hardship with an unshakable trust in God. He remembered his father saying, "My son, the world will try to make you small, but God made you big on the inside. That's where you have to live." In that instant, Elias chose to live in his faith, not in the humiliation being offered to him. The lieutenant's final thrust came with a tone of command. "Sergeant Elias, save your faith for the chapel. Here, in this command, we follow orders based on intelligence, not on delusions." The word delusions hung in the air, venomous and definitive. It was the final blow, the complete disqualification. He wasn't just disagreeing with a tactic. He was invalidating the very essence of Elias, his spirituality, his source of strength. The humiliation was complete. The sergeant was reduced in front of everyone to a foolish and hallucinating old man. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with embarrassment from the veterans and ill-disguised triumph from the lieutenant's followers. Everyone expected Elias to hang his head and retreat in shame. But Elias did not hang his head. He did not retreat. Instead, anyone watching him closely could see an almost imperceptible movement. He took a deep, slow breath, as if drawing air not from the stuffy tent, but from a much purer and deeper source. The narrator who knows his soul knows that in that second, Elias was no longer there, in that dusty base. He was back in his childhood backyard, hearing his mother's deep voice telling him, "When the world shouts, let God whisper in your ear. His voice is gentle, but it brings down any wall." The lieutenant's humiliation was a loud, strident shout, but the whisper of God in his heart was a serene and unshakable force. He felt the firm ground under his boots and anchored himself in that ancient promise. A different kind of silence took over the tent. It was no longer a silence of obedience or embarrassment. It was a silence of expectation. The mocking smiles on the younger soldiers' faces disappeared, replaced by a confused curiosity. The veterans, who had previously averted their gaze for fear of the hierarchy, now stared at the scene, their faces tense. There was something in Elias's posture that defied the logic of the situation. He did not look like a defeated man. On the contrary, amidst the storm of contempt, he seemed to be the only point of calm, a firm rock against which the waves of the lieutenant's arrogance were breaking. His serenity was so intense that it became in itself a form of rebuke, far more powerful than any shout. Then, with a firmness that silenced even the most hostile thoughts, Elias raised his gaze and looked Lieutenant Ricardo directly in the eyes. There was no defiance in his gaze, no anger. There was a sad compassion and an authority that came not from his rank, but from his conviction. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words came out calm, measured, but each one carried the weight of the truth he felt in his soul. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, intelligence shows us what the enemy wants us to see." He paused, letting the sentence hang in the dense air. "But my faith shows me what God wants me to protect, and he tells me that down that path we won't be sending heroes home, but grief to their families." Elias's response fell on the tent like a stone in a calm lake. The ripples of shock spread instantly. It was not insubordination, not in the way military manuals would define it. It was something much deeper, a declaration of loyalty to a higher command, an authority that transcended the earthly hierarchy. It was the affirmation that protecting the lives of his brothers was a divine commandment, more important than any battle plan. The tension in the tent became almost unbearable. You could cut the air with a knife. No one dared to move or breathe. The confrontation had escalated from a tactical dispute to a battle between faith and reason, between the wisdom of heaven and the arrogance of earth. Lieutenant Ricardo's face, once flushed with pride, was now pale with fury. Elias's calmness disarmed and enraged him even more. That response was not something he could counter with logic or regulations. It was a terrain he did not know, and therefore he feared and hated it. His authority, the only tool he truly possessed, had been publicly challenged. For him, there was only one way out: to crush this veiled insubordination with the weight of the regulations. He opened his mouth, the muscle in his jaw trembling. With restrained anger, ready to give the order that would end the sergeant's career and freedom. "Sergeant, you are under arrest for But the order never left his mouth. Before the last word could be formed, a sharp, panic-laden scream cut through the air, coming from the corner of the tent. "Command, command, do you copy? Urgent message." It was the radio operator, a young man who until then had just been part of the scenery. He tore off his headphones, his eyes wide with terror. The desperate crackle of the radio invaded the deadly silence, bringing with it a reality that was about to collide with the lieutenant's arrogance. All attention, previously fixed on Elias and Ricardo, turned abruptly to the source of that sound, the harbinger that something terrible had happened. The message, broken by static, was from one of the scouts, a small reconnaissance team that, out of an excess of zeal or disobedience, had advanced a little further than ordered. The voice on the other end of the line was desperate, almost a whisper of dread. "Command, ambush! I repeat, massive ambush! They are entrenched in the high ground of the gorge, heavy weaponry. They are waiting for us. It would be a massacre, I repeat, a massacre." The radio operator repeated the words, his own voice trembling. "The main route, sir. It's a trap, exactly as—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The sergeant's name hung invisibly and heavily in the air. A shocked silence, much deeper and heavier than any before, fell upon the tent. It was a silence of revelation, of dread, and of an undeniable truth. The gazes, as if choreographed by an invisible force, made a slow and inevitable journey. First, to the radio that still crackled with the echo of avoided death, then to the pale and astonished face of Lieutenant Ricardo, and finally, every pair of eyes, from the high-ranking officers to the privates, landed on Sergeant Elias. The mockery, the distrust, the pity, it all disappeared. What remained was a mixture of awe, fear, and a respect so profound it was almost palpable. The arrogant face of Lieutenant Ricardo crumbled. The color drained from his features, leaving behind a pale, grayish mask of pure shock. His brilliant plan, the fruit of his superior intelligence, the proof of his worth, had just been exposed as a direct path to the deaths of 1,000 men. The man he had humiliated, whom he had called superstitious and delusional, the man whose faith he had despised, had just saved the life of everyone in the tent and all those waiting outside under the relentless sun. The weight of this revelation crushed him. His shoulders slumped, his mouth hung open, and his eyes, once full of fire, were now empty, lost, staring at Elias as if seeing an apparition. And Sergeant Elias? He remained there, in the same spot, with the same serene posture. There was not a hint of triumph on his face, no shadow of, "I told you so." His eyes did not celebrate a personal victory, but carried a quiet sadness, the pain of knowing that it took the confirmation of a massacre for the voice of prudence and faith to be heard. In that moment, he was not the sergeant who proved himself right. He was the personification of divine grace, a silent instrument that God used to protect his children. His calm in the midst of the chaos of revelation was the final proof that his strength did not come from this world. The order he followed was not from the command, but from the Creator himself. The news spread through the base like wildfire on dry grass. It needed no orders or official communications. The soldiers who had been in the tent came out with transformed faces, and their looks, their whispered words, told the story faster than any radio. The main route, the path of glory promised by the lieutenant, was a death sentence, and old Sergeant Elias, the quiet man whom many viewed with a mixture of pity and disdain, the man who prayed before dawn, was the one who saved them. The perception of him changed instantly. The silence that was once seen as passivity was now interpreted as wisdom. The calmness that seemed like weakness was now seen as a monumental strength. The mission had to be completely redefined. The map was opened again on the table, but this time no one was looking at Lieutenant Ricardo. All eyes, including those of the colonel who was supervising the operation from a distance by radio, were on Elias. It was one of the older officers who broke the awkward silence. "Sergeant, that alternative route of yours, show it to us again." Elias, without any change in his humble posture, approached the table. With the same calmness as before, he traced the new path with his finger, explaining the points of advantage, the places for cover, the way they could advance more safely. He did not speak like a strategist, but like a shepherd, guiding his flock through a dangerous valley. Lieutenant Ricardo remained leaning against one of the tent poles, shrunken, as if he wanted to disappear. Every word from Elias was a confirmation of his own catastrophic failure. The humiliation he had tried to inflict on the sergeant was now his, multiplied by 1,000. He saw the looks of his subordinates, and there was no more admiration, only a cutting coldness, the silent contempt for a leader who, out of vanity, had almost killed them all. He looked at Elias, and no longer saw a superstitious old man. He saw a man whose connection to something greater was so real and powerful that he could foresee danger and move destiny. The arrogance that defined him crumbled to dust, leaving only raw shame and the frightening realization of his own insignificance. The new operation, based on the route suggested by Elias, was put into practice. Every step was taken with a caution and respect that had not existed before. The soldiers were no longer just following a hierarchical order. They were following the guidance of a man who in their eyes had a direct line to the divine. Elias's faith, once a private source of mockery, became the unofficial good luck charm of the entire troop. Young soldiers, the same ones who had smiled at the sergeant hours before, were seen discreetly making the sign of the cross or murmuring a quick prayer before advancing. Faith, once expelled from the command tent, now marched on the front line, in the heart of every man. During the mission, which unfolded over a tense and exhausting day, Sergeant Elias led by example. He didn't need to shout orders. His presence was enough. He was always at the most critical point, offering a word of calm to a frightened soldier, adjusting a nervous recruit's aim, or simply being there, a pillar of tranquility amidst the controlled chaos. His leadership was not imposed, it was inspiring. The men fought with more courage because they trusted the wisdom that guided them. The mission was a success, not because of boldness, but because of prudence. There were no casualties. No grief was sent home that day. Upon returning to base, exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but all alive, the atmosphere was completely different. There was no boisterous euphoria of a hard-won victory. There was a solemn respect, a silent gratitude that hung over the camp. Soldiers would pass by Elias and nod their heads, a simple gesture that contained a universe of meaning. They were nods of apology, of thanks, of reverence. The man who had been humiliated that morning was now the anonymous hero of that battalion. His honor was restored not by a medal or a promotion, but by the look in the eyes of each of the men whose lives he had saved. That night, loneliness found Lieutenant Ricardo. He isolated himself in his small tent, the silence amplifying the sound of his own conscience. The cruel words he had used against Elias echoed in his mind. Delusions, superstition, save your faith for the chapel. Every word now burned him from the inside. He, the man of reason and intelligence, had been blind, and the man of faith, the man he despised, possessed a clearer vision than any satellite. The crisis he faced was not professional, it was existential. Everything he believed about strength, leadership, and knowledge had been pulverized in a single day. He remembered his own training at the military academy. He remembered the instructors who preached cold logic, the suppression of emotions, the absolute belief in strategy. Faith was treated as a weakness, a sentimental variable that had no place on the battlefield. He had embraced this philosophy with his entire being, believing it would make him a superior leader. Now he saw the truth. His logic had almost turned him into a butcher, and the faith he so despised was the only thing that prevented the catastrophe. The structure of his inner world was collapsing, and he felt small, lost, and deeply ashamed. Meanwhile, Sergeant Elias was where he always was, at the end of the day. In a remote corner of the camp, away from the noise and movement, looking up at the starry backland sky. He was not celebrating. He was giving thanks. His prayer was not one of triumph, but of gratitude for God's mercy. He felt no anger toward the lieutenant. He felt pity. He saw in him a frightened boy, drowning in his own pride. Elias understood that the ordeal of that morning was not just about him. It was a lesson for everyone, including the young officer. God did not humiliate the lieutenant to exalt Elias. He allowed the truth to come to light to save lives and, perhaps, to save a soul from arrogance. In the middle of the night, the flap of Elias's tent opened gently. It was Lieutenant Ricardo. He stood there in the entrance, a silhouette cut against the faint light of the camp. His uniform, once impeccable, seemed too big for him. His face was drawn, his eyes swollen. He looked like a man who had cried for the first time in many years. For a long moment, he just stood, there in silence, unable to find the words. Elias turned, and his gaze held no judgment, just a quiet, patient acceptance. He waited, giving the young man the space he needed to face his own humiliation. Finally, with a choked voice, almost a whisper, Lieutenant Ricardo spoke. "Sergeant, He swallowed hard, the word sorry seeming too heavy to come out. Elias perceived the young man's internal struggle. He didn't need to hear the word to understand the feeling. The lieutenant's gesture, the simple act of coming there in that state of vulnerability, was already an apology more eloquent than any speech. This was the real battlefield for Ricardo, not the backlands, but his own soul, where his pride was being surrendered. Elias simply nodded, a silent invitation for him to continue, if he wished. The young officer entered the tent and sat on an empty ammunition crate, his body bent forward, elbows on his knees. He looked at his own hands, as if he didn't recognize them. "I was going to kill them all," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was going to march 1,000 men into a slaughter, and I would have called them heroes. I was so blind, so full of myself." The words came out in a flood of painful confession. "You tried to warn me, and I humiliated you. I attacked the only thing that really matters about you, your faith, and it was that faith that was trying to save us." In that moment, he was not a lieutenant speaking to a sergeant. He was just a broken man before another. Elias sat on his cot facing him. The small tent seemed like a makeshift confessional under the stars. He listened patiently, letting the young man empty his heart of all its arrogance and shame. When Ricardo finally fell silent, exhausted by his own confession, Elias spoke, his voice as gentle as the night breeze. "Lieutenant, pride is the most dangerous ground a man can walk on. It makes us believe that our maps are more reliable than the compass God gave us in our chests. Today you didn't lose a battle. You were just forced to look at the right compass." There was no accusation in his words, only the wisdom of one who had already walked through dark valleys. "But how?" the lieutenant asked, his face lifted, his eyes searching for an answer. "How did you know? It wasn't just intuition, was it? It was real. You saw it, didn't you?" Elias looked at the sky through a small opening in the canvas. "I don't see the future, Lieutenant. What I have is a conversation. A conversation my parents taught me to have. Sometimes God speaks through a certainty in the heart. Sometimes he gives us a feeling of peace to follow one path, or a feeling of dread to avoid another. That night, I felt dread. I felt the grief of the mothers who would receive the news. I asked God for clarity, and he showed me the danger. My only merit was in listening." That conversation stretched into the dawn. Lieutenant Ricardo, the man of logic and reason, asked questions he never thought he would ask. He asked about faith, about prayer, about how to hear that silent voice. And Elias, the simple man from the backlands, answered with the simplicity of his experience. He didn't preach a sermon, didn't cite complex theologies. He spoke of his mother kneeling on the dirt floor, of his father giving thanks for the rain, of how faith wasn't about understanding God, but about trusting Him, especially when nothing makes sense. For the first time, Ricardo was listening, truly listening. At dawn, as the first rays of sun touched the base, Lieutenant Ricardo emerged from Elias's tent a different man. The arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility. The blind certainty in his own intelligence had given way to a deep respect for a wisdom he could not measure or explain. He did not ask for forgiveness with words, but his actions in the days and weeks that followed were proof of his transformation. He began to listen more, to observe, to value the experience of the veterans, and, from time to time, soldiers would see him standing silently, looking at the horizon, as if he too were trying to start his own conversation with the sky. Sergeant Elias's reputation was solidified. He became a silent legend in the battalion, not the kind of legend about heroic deeds and sure shots, but about a different kind of strength. He was living proof that true courage is not in having no fear, but in having the faith to move forward despite it. Soldiers sought him out no longer for tactical questions, but for advice, a word of comfort, or just to be near the peace he radiated. The man who was called delusional became the spiritual advisor to 1,000 men. The humiliation in the command tent was never forgotten, but it was redefined. It was no longer a memory of shame for Elias, but a testimony to the power of God. It became the story the veterans told the rookies to teach them about true leadership. The story of how a lieutenant tried to humiliate a sergeant, but little. Did he know that the order the sergeant followed came from a much higher command? The price of that humiliation was paid not with revenge, but with salvation. God did not punish Ricardo. He broke him to remake him better. On that day, under the relentless backland sun, 1,000 men learned a lesson that no military academy could teach. They learned that on the battlefield of life, the most powerful strategy is not in the maps, the satellite images, or artificial intelligence. The most powerful strategy lies in the humble courage of a heart that silences itself to hear the voice of God. Elias remained the same soft-spoken sergeant, but to everyone there, he held the highest rank of all, that of a man who walks with the Creator. Divine justice was subtle but definitive. It came not in the form of punishment for the lieutenant, but in his complete and painful transformation. Arrogance was exposed and annihilated, not by force, but by truth. Elias's honor was restored not by men, but by God Himself, who used the attempt at humiliation to reveal His glory and protect His children. It was a silent yet thunderous testimony that faith is not a delusion, but the clearest vision a human being can have. The story of that day became part of the soul of that battalion, an eternal reminder that true strength is made perfect in weakness. The journey of Elias and the transformation of Ricardo left a permanent mark on all who witnessed it. It showed that faith is not an escape from reality, but a tool to face it. It demonstrated that humility is not weakness, but the channel through which true strength flows. The respect Elias earned was not based on fear or hierarchy, but on love and gratitude. He became the shepherd of that troop, caring for their souls with the same dedication with which he cared for their physical safety. That event forever sealed the difference between the power that comes from rank and the authority that comes from heaven. Life on the military base was never the same again. A new kind of respect settled among the men, a recognition that there were forces at play greater than their strategies and their weapons. Lieutenant Ricardo, guided by his newfound humility, became a better, more humane, and more effective leader. He learned to combine the intelligence of the manuals with the wisdom of the heart, to listen not only to his superiors, but also to the voice of experience, and perhaps the whisper of faith. The salvation of 1,000. Men began with the humiliation of one, proving that God's ways are indeed mysterious and perfect. Sergeant Elias never sought recognition. For him, what happened was just God being God. He continued his silent prayers at dawn, his faith as unshakable as ever. But something had changed. The loneliness of his faith amidst disbelief had disappeared. Now he was surrounded by men who, even if they didn't fully understand his connection with the divine, respected it deeply. He no longer had to save his faith for the chapel. It was present in every look of gratitude, in every respectful nod, in every life that continued to breathe because of his obedience to an order only he had heard. Years later, when he told this story, Elias's voice remained the same, calm and without a trace of vainglory. He did not focus on the humiliation he suffered, but on the mercy he witnessed. The story was not about him, but about the faithfulness of God. It was his testimony, his offering of gratitude for having been used as an instrument. He proved that a man on his knees in conversation with God is more powerful than an army that trusts only in its own strength. And that truth echoed forever in the hearts of those who were saved by the faith of a sergeant in the backlands. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains and transform the greatest humiliations into testimonies of His glory. Thank you for listening.